Okay, well, we're going to start with the Easter story as it's told in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verses 1 through 10. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to the tomb to see Jesus. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord, descending from heaven, came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, for he's been raised. As he said, come and see the place where he lay. And then go quickly and tell his disciples he's been raised from the dead. And indeed, he's going ahead of you to Galilee, and there you'll see him, and this is my message for you." So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell Jesus' disciples. And suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him. And they took hold of his feet and worshiped him. And then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid, but go tell my brothers and sisters to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." That ends the gospel reading. And from the epistle of 2 Corinthians, chapter 4, verses 6 through 9 and 16 through 18. It says, "For it is God who said, 'Light will shine out of darkness,' who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in clay jars, so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We're afflicted in every way, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but not driven to despair. We're persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. So we do not lose heart. Even though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed day by day. For our slight momentary affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure, because we look not to what can be seen, but to what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal." And finally, one verse from 2 Corinthians 5:17. "So if anyone's in Christ, there's a new creation. Everything old has passed away. Look, new things have come into being." Before I start preaching, there are a few slides of art. It's kind of hard for artists to render the resurrection, but we have a few that we can just look at. Maybe the empty tomb is the best. I love this one. And this one, Mary was weeping, and Jesus comes to her, and she thinks he's the gardener. And when we show art, we almost always remind ourselves that Jesus was not a Caucasian person. And this one I love because it gets all of creation and all of the world involved in the resurrection. And as I was sharing with the kids, resurrection living, choosing life, choosing healing and wholeness impacts how we treat the earth as well. Okay, well, if you're new to us or visiting this morning, we started our Holy Week celebration this year with a new service. We did it last year. This was the second year. We call it Alabaster Wednesday. And drawing from the work of a brilliant Episcopal priest and scholar named Cynthia Bourgeot, we remembered and honored the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus, and how just before his death on about Wednesday of Holy Week, Mary anointed Jesus with this very expensive perfume called spikenard, letting him know, it was often used for burial, letting him know that she understood, that she got it. He was facing his own death. The disciples still were hoping that was not the case. But she let him know she got it. She was with him. She understood. And she and Jesus' mother stayed with Jesus throughout the entire ordeal, and they were the ones who got his body off the cross and carried it and laid it in a borrowed tomb. So it should not surprise us that the first person Jesus appears to on Easter morning is Mary. That was no accident or no coincidence. And she and a handful of other women in a culture in which women had no rights, and in which the word of a woman was not even considered substantial enough or trustworthy enough to be valid in a legal court. In that culture, Jesus appears first only to the women and says, in essence, go tell the boys. You know, some sick part of me this morning as I was thinking about this, I could not get Arnold Schwarzenegger in The Terminator out of my mind when he says, I'm back, you know. Go tell the boys. Tell everyone. We're not done yet. This isn't over. Jesus was radically pro-woman and pro-human and all of creation, and that's not my main point today, and I'm about to leave it, but I just want to make sure that we don't miss it. Because once you start noticing this stuff, you'll see it everywhere in the Gospels. Part of the Holy Week and Easter message is that many religions had and still have it wrong when it comes to gender issues. And if you're following Jesus, then you are deeply respectful of the full participation and dignity and giftedness of women. As Richard Rohr puts it, sorry, but we men don't come out looking too good in Holy Week. The only ones who kept shining when the rubber hit the road were the women. Now, speaking of Richard Rohr, now there's a little bit of chuckling and probably some rolling of the eyes because those who are here, I talk about Richard Rohr all the time. I don't quote anyone else near as much as I do him. And I mean, in all seriousness, well, sorry, I'm not sorry, you know, because he's that good. And I am convinced that he and his work will be regarded as historically significant. And what I hope most is that some of you will start reading his books yourselves. They're accessible. You don't have to be a theological nerd or a seminary graduate to read Richard Rohr's work. But he and others close to him that I also often quote, like Cynthia Bourgeot, Bryan McFarland, James Finley, Nadia Boltz-Weber, Shane Claiborne, Doug Paget, Otis Moss III, Barbara Brown Taylor, are all figures at the heart of a reformation that's happening in the church right now in history. We are living in the midst of a reformation that I'm completely convinced is every bit as significant as the Protestant Reformation 500 years ago with Martin Luther and John Calvin and that crowd. We're living it right now. But what I want you to also know is that when I'm doing my study and my preparation for my sermons, I don't go first to Richard Rohr. I live with it. I study the text. I wrestle with it. I speak in my little recorder, you know, things that come to me. I shared that with you before. And then sometimes I say, oh, I wonder what Lord Richard, no, I'm kidding. Wonder what he has to say. So this week, after doing all my own work in preparation, I finally decided, let me see what Richard Rohr says about Easter. And I did a search, and sure enough, on YouTube comes up a little homily. And, you know, I love the word homily from the Catholic Church. I think it's Catholic's way of saying keep it brief. But he starts off, he reads the Easter story from John, and then he says this. He says, I'm not sure where I heard this. I think it was in a movie, but there's a quote that goes something like this. In the end, everything's going to be all right. So if it's not all right, it's not the end. And then he says, well, I could just end my Easter message there. He didn't, and I won't either. But let me say it again in case you didn't catch it. In the end, everything's going to be all right. And if it's not all right, then it's not the end. Now, I want you to take that away with you this morning. For some of you, I guarantee it will last you all the way to Christmas Eve. Let's say it together. Repeat after me the first part. In the end, everything will be all right. Say it.
In the end, everything will be all right.
If it's not all right, then it's not the end.
If it's not all right, then it's not the end.
Now, what? Thank you. Thank you for playing along. Now, when I put words in your mouth like that, I actually do that with a lot of respect. Because I'm always putting myself in your shoes. I know some of you don't believe this stuff. And I try to imagine, how's that going to feel for those who've been through this or that? Will it feel offensive to some people? Do I really believe that? Is it true? Is everything really going to be all right? Because there's plenty that's clearly not all right now. Well, I'll come back to this. There are two other biblical scholars that are kind of my go-to people, especially when it comes to the big Christian holidays like Christmas and Easter. And that's Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan. They are also scholars, biblical scholars of historic magnitude, because they've offered a way of looking at Jesus and the Bible and supernatural stories like healing miracles and that kind of stuff that honor the struggles that so many intelligent, scientifically engaged people have when it comes to biblical accounts that defy laws of nature, such as the Easter story. And they would argue that you really don't have to believe in the literal raising from the dead of Jesus' human body to believe in the spirit of resurrection love that's at the heart of the church. Personally, I have no problem believing in an actual, literal, physical resurrection, but many do. So Borg and Crossan say that whether or not Jesus literally rose from the dead isn't the main point. The main point is, what's it mean? And they see it more as like a parable, a story that contains some deep, deep truth, but that may not be literally true. As I often quote the scholar who says, yeah, all the Bible's true, some of it actually happened. Or, I take the Bible too seriously to take it literally. Those are great guiding quotes. So for them, the question is, what's it mean? And they would say that Jesus did, in a profound sense, come back to life after he was killed, that he was resurrected in the hearts and in the faith of those who gather in Jesus' name and who keep his message and his mission alive. They would say that the meaning of Easter is that the presence of Christ came to life in a whole new way in the church, in people who remember his life and his teachings, and one who continue the work Jesus started of bringing new life and hope and healing and compassion and justice to the world. And they would say that resurrection power is the power of love to face and deal with ultimately prevail with anything. And they would also say that there are two main ways to experience and live out Easter. The first is for each of us as an individual. As so many spiritual teachers from many different religions suggest, there's a process of dying and being reborn that we all experience again and again if we're on a conscious spiritual journey and doing what many would refer to as our inner work. They say it's about dealing with our egos, basically, our small selves. The ultimate point is becoming new. As the Apostle Paul puts it, we die to our old selves, the old has passed away, and we rise with Christ into newness of life. In other words, we die to our selfishness, our egocentrism, our small selves, and then we rise with Christ into a new way of being who we truly are, which is about love and kindness and justice and mercy and patience and bringing all the fruits of the Spirit, gentleness, joy, all the best stuff from the Bible. Micah 6:8, the big three as I've taught you there. To do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with God, to be a humble person. All these things come to life in us, and we rise up into a life in which that's who we are. We're committed to living that way, to being that way. That's what our lives are about. We embrace that commitment. We nurture it. We grow into it. We practice it. We practice it. Reminds me of the kid who one time someone asked him what their family's religion was. He said, well, my dad's a practicing Catholic. Yeah, he's not very good at it. We commit ourselves to it. We become the best lovers we can be. My friend Shane Claiborne had a little business card one time, and it said, Shane Claiborne, professional lover. He said it was always a conversation starter. The point is that we become more and more loving all the time. We're not perfect, but we're always growing and reaching within and into God for more love, more ways to give and to serve others. And sure, we've all got our own blind spots and our shadows, and so we do the inner work of dealing with that and working with that and loving ourselves enough to be gracious and forgiving with ourselves when we mess up, and to be able to laugh at ourselves at our 2 steps forward, 3 steps back way of growing, because that's all of us. Sounds pretty good to me. But the second meaning of Easter that Borg and Crossan say must not be forgotten, and it historically has been too often, and they chide the church for not living this out more consistently. He said there is a political, or if you prefer the word, public, or collective, or communal, or social way of understanding Easter also. Their point is that if Easter was just about saying that God's love is more powerful and stronger than death, then Jesus could have made that point by dying of old age and just coming back to life whenever it happened. He could have made that point by having a fatal accident and coming back to life. But they say that's not how it happened. He died at age 33 after challenging the powers that be, executed by the state. He was crucified by Rome for challenging the values of empire and the domination system of his day. And so they say for that aspect, Easter is vindication, not vengeance, but God's way of saying what Jesus stood for, speaking truth to power and facing the consequences, that will be vindicated. That kind of courageous love will have the final word. Or in other words, it'll be all right. As Tennessee Representative Justin Pearson said just last week after being expelled in a racist manner from the state legislative body for protesting disruptively in the legislative hall against assault weapons in the aftermath of the recent shooting of Nashville, he said, I heard him right after he got expelled, "The truth of justice cannot be expelled because the heart of justice cannot be killed." And when I heard him say that, I just smiled and said, "Happy Easter, brother." Well, let's end by going back to the Richard Rohr quote. I was curious where it came from. He said, "I think I heard it in a movie." I was like, "Oh, okay, what's the movie?" So I did a little bit of digging. And this quote has been actually attributed to a number of different people: Oscar Wilde, John Lennon, author Paulo Coelho. The movie was The Best Exotic Marigold Hotel, but the earliest documented use of it appeared in 1988 in a Brazilian-Portuguese book called The Checkerboard by Fernando Sabino. And he says his father used to say this to him. And here's the quote from his book. "Perhaps the best thing I can remember is what he said to me one day when he found me in the grip of mental affliction. 'My son,' he said, 'everything works out in the end. If it didn't, it's because it hasn't come to an end yet.'" And when I read that, I thought, oh, that's even better. If it didn't. Because God knows there are things in this world and in our lives that didn't just, quote, work out, that we can't go back and change or undo. The marriage ended. The abuse happened. That loved one didn't make it. And we've still got a hole in our hearts. All the injustice and heinous things that have happened historically, there's no way for us to make it right. You know what I'm saying. But this is where the miracle of Easter is so powerful. Because love will be the final word, whether that happens in the form of grace that somehow leads to deeper healing as we continue to embrace life, or in the form of healings and reunions that await on the other side of our own resurrection. It's not over. The mystery is deeper and more beautiful than we can imagine. And Jesus is inviting us to embrace that and to live our lives as if we trust that. So let's say it together one last time. Repeat after me. In the end, it's going to be all right. If it's not all right, it isn't the end. Whatever you're working with, God is with you. Easter resurrection power is in you, within you, around you. So, happy Easter. Amen.